Hello and welcome. I'm delighted to be with you today for this exciting Positive Links Distinguished Speaker series with Dr. Ella Washington speaking the unspoken, cracking the rules of the workplace. And I'm Monica Werlein, Faculty Director at the Center for Positive Organizations. I'd like to give you a few notes about our technology today. We're in webinar mode, so the chat feature and the audio features are disabled, but the Q&A panel is live and we'll be watching for your questions. You can also toggle transcription on your toolbar. And I'd like to thank some of our sponsors for today's session. We have generous sponsorship from the Sanger Leadership Center, the Tauber Institute for Global Operations, and the Zell Lurie Institute for Entrepreneurial Studies, who help us bring this seminar series to you. We have developed a promotional partnership that helps us get the word out, and we'd love for you to join us. We thank our promotional partners today, Ann Arbor Spark, the Managerial and Organizational Cognition Division of the Academy of Management, and the Organizational Development and Change Division of the Academy of Management. If you'd like to be a promotional partner, we'd love to hear from you. We also have at the Center for Positive Organizations been working on building a co-learning consortium, a community of people interested in the broad field of positive organizational scholarship who want to come together, learn from world experts like Dr. Washington, and also engage in non-expert driven learning across generations, across institutional boundaries, across sectors and disciplines. If you'd like to know more about that, we invite you to consider and get in touch with us about our co-learning consortium. And finally, today, as we get started, I'd like to remind you that we love bringing these positive links dialogues to you and that they are supported by our community. So we would generously and gratefully receive any gift that you might want to give in support of keeping the Positive Links seminars available, free, and open to everyone around the world who's curious about these topics. And today, I am delighted to share the stage with Dr. Ella Washington, who is a globally recognized expert in how we approach work. She is an organizational psychologist, and so I feel a collegial affiliation to her, even though we've never met in person, but we have lots of colleagues in common. And some of the things I admire most about Dr. Washington's work are that she, like other members of the Center for Positive Organizations, is deeply dedicated to helping do research, write, teach, talk, consult, and share about how we build thriving organizations in this rapidly changing world that we live in. She is a professor at Georgetown University's McDonough School of Business, a prior speaker here at the Center for Positive Organizations. So we're so lucky to have her as a member of our scholarly community. And she describes her mission as elevating humanity in the workplace, which I adore the way that you're embracing that mission and owning your strengths and your authenticity, Dr. Washington, which is part of what you'll talk with us about today. Dr. Washington is the author of two highly acclaimed books. The Necessary Journey, Making Real Progress on Equity and Inclusion, is really considered a must-read for organizations that are dedicated to meaningful change and inclusive work environments. And the second book, entitled Unspoken, is more of what Dr. Washington will be talking with us about today. And so, Ella, thank you so much for joining us. Welcome back to Positive Links.
Thank you so much, Monica, and the whole Positive Links team for having me. Thank you all for being here. It's so exciting to be here and sharing my work with you and a topic that is near and dear to my heart around navigating unspoken rules in the workplace. And so with that, I will go ahead and get started. Thank you again for that warm introduction. So, as an organizational psychologist, my work has always been focused on how do we make workplaces better for every single person there? How do we make sure that we're able to thrive in our own organizations, no matter what our industry, no matter what our interests, whether we're at the start of our career or we're making a career pivot? I think it's so important for us to be in workplace environments where we can thrive and for us to have the knowledge on how to navigate those work environments, particularly when we're navigating environments that maybe weren't made with us in mind, whether that's from a historically marginalized population, whether we're first generation in our work environment, or for a myriad of other reasons why we may not feel as included or that we belong in those workplaces. And for me, I am so passionate about providing tools and research and knowledge for people to understand how they can navigate those environments, how they can succeed and thrive in those environments, even when they were not made necessarily with them in mind. A few years ago, this meme came across my desk and it just tickled me because I am a huge Beyonce fan, and have even written some research articles on navigating exclusion in the workplace, using Beyonce as an example. And so when I saw this a few years ago, after the release of one of her previous albums, it just tickled me because, it says, as you can see, me on the way to my job, listening to a Beyonce song telling me to quit my job. And if you're not familiar, it's a song called Break Your Soul. And in the song, she talks about, releasing your stress and releasing your job if it's stressing you out. And I thought this meme was really interesting because while it may be funny at the surface, I thought about it, and there's so many people who do feel like this when it's time for them to physically go to work or to log into work, or they get those Sunday scaries when they think about work the next day. And so for me, I know this is a very real experience for folks. How can we make workplaces environments where we don't feel like this on the way to work, or knowing that it's, tomorrow is Monday and we have to log back in after a holiday or the weekend? And to put some numbers behind this feeling, for most of us, work plays a really important role. Research tells us that about 1/3 of our lives, if not more, I'd say, are spent working in the workplace or working. And that translates to 81,396 hours, give or take. In fact, research tells us that the only thing that we spend more time doing than working over the course of our lives is sleeping. And if you're like me and being honest, we don't always get those 8 hours of sleep that we're supposed to get. And so if we spend so much of our lives at work, I honestly believe it shouldn't be a place that we hate going or we feel like is breaking our souls, if you will, right? And for too many people, it does feel like that. Gallup finds that 60% of people are emotionally detached at work, and another 19% are straight up miserable in their jobs. And so, as an organizational psychologist, I am dedicated to the mission of elevating humanity in the workplace. And part of that is making workplace environments that don't feel like they break our souls. And so in my work, there's a particular area of interest that started, I would say, probably back all the way in graduate school, but certainly when I had my first corporate job in professional services. I realized that, many of us can relate to this if you know experience. You may have used this hashtag on social media or seen it. And if you know alludes to something that's an inside joke or an experience for only some people to be privy to. For example, a post online might say, I discovered the best new restaurant in the city. If you know. Right. And so that's something that we could understand. Maybe we don't know what that restaurant is. Maybe they'll tell us, maybe they won't. Maybe it's a secret that we're not let in on. And so some of that is just in good fun. But other things that we experience, if you know, in the workplace, can certainly have a much more detrimental impact. In every workplace, there are those written and unwritten rules of workplace culture. So there are the formal workplace expectations, those things that you may see in an HR handbook. For example, maybe the HR handbook tells you that the work hours of this organization are from 9 to 5 p.m., right? But then there are also those unspoken rules or informal practices that govern how we do things every day, such as no one really schedules meetings maybe after 3 p.m. on a Friday. So while that wouldn't be a spoken or a formal rule, once you've worked park there for a bit of time, you may pick up on the fact that, most meetings kind of end by a certain time on Fridays. And so that's an example of a unspoken or unwritten rule compared to those formal and written rules. Digging a bit more into those unspoken rules, here are some examples that you may be familiar with. So first, it's not what you know, but who you know. So that rule, talks about the importance of networking and relationship building in addition to displaying your competence, right? So it may be something you've heard all of your career. And it's something that we just take at face value, but certainly that is one of those unspoken rules. It may be spoken in jest, but it's certainly not spoken in your employee handbook, right? When you first join an organization. Another unspoken rule could be don't leave the office before your boss, right? So while there may not be a specific time that you are supposed to leave the office, maybe you pick up on the fact that no one leaves before their manager, or when their manager leaves, then they feel comfortable leaving at that time or after, right? And another unspoken rule would be, your brand extends beyond the office. Oftentimes we think about what our professional brand is and how people look at us and how we present ourselves at work. But in today's ever-connected world of LinkedIn and other social media outlets, as well as even just working from home and understanding how you're showing up virtually in environments just like we're in today, that that's kind of one of those unspoken things that people are likely evaluating you beyond just what they see in that 9 to 5 capacity, especially if you're very active on outlets like LinkedIn. So, we could go for days with examples, and I welcome you to put any examples that come to mind for you about unspoken rules in the chat for us to discuss as we move into our question and answers. But just to level set for everyone, by definition, unspoken rules are those implicit expectations or norms regarding behavior, communication, and professional conduct that are understood and adhered to without being formally articulated. So research shows that, unspoken rules in the workplace typically align with behaviors of whomever is in the majority group of that workplace. And the biggest challenge with the if you know cultures is that by design, some people are not supposed to know those rules. Some people are not in the in crowd of that information. And so while these rules can feel normal to some, and particularly those in whomever is the majority in that organization, they can feel the complete opposite to other folks. They can be obscure, invisible, and exclusionary to those outside of the majority, especially with people from historically marginalized identities. So I like to ask the audience, how often do you think unspoken rules have an influence on your experience at work or your success at work? And we're going to pop up a poll question for you all to answer, and I'd love to see these results. How often do you think unspoken rules influence success at work? Rarely, occasionally, often, or maybe all of the time? And so as we're getting those polls in, I'd like to share some data as we're getting those poll results, and that more than 1 in 3 people agree that informal or unspoken rules about how to advance to get promoted exist. And so this data comes from a partnership I have with the Gallup Center on Black Voices. And as I was doing research for Unspoken, my book, I wanted to know, do people even know about unspoken rules, and what do they think about them? How are they experiencing unspoken rules? And so I'll pause for us to get the results of that poll. Okay, excellent. Thank you all so much for your engagement here. So 3% of us say rarely, 18% say occasionally, 52%, which is a huge percentage, say often that unspoken rules influence our success at work, and 28% say all of the time. I'm experiencing these things consciously or maybe even unconsciously all of the time. And so, that tracks with the data that, found that more than 1 in 3 agree that informal or unspoken rules about how to advance and get promoted do exist. So thank you all so much for your engagement there. Going a little bit deeper in that data that I researched with Gallup, knowing the unspoken rules exist, that's only half the battle. The real challenge we find is the impact they can actually have on your career. And so 1 in 3 workers actually agree that people who don't follow unspoken rules usually don't advance very far in their career. And so that first question was around how often do you experience them, or how much do they have an impact? And then we find that a significant amount of people also feel like they maybe can't advance very far if they don't know these rules. When we looked at the experiences of unspoken rules based on race and gender, in that Gallup data, we found a really interesting kind of dynamic here, one that you may expect. And so, what we saw is that when we look at value, so I feel like a valued member of my team, or I am treated at work, I'm treated with respect at work, had an impact based on members that were Black, Hispanic, or white. And so what you're seeing here, and I'm sorry if you're not seeing the Black, Hispanic, and white delineations here on this graph, but the chart in the darker color, that is the white respondents. The second chart would be the Asian respondents. The third chart would be Hispanic respondents, and the last chart here, last bar here, is on the Black respondents. And what you see is that there is a difference in how much folks of different racial demographic groups answered this question around feeling valued as a member of their team, and if they were treated as respect. Going a bit deeper, I'd love to ask a second question. When you think about those unspoken rules that we've been chatting about, which unspoken rule do you think has been the most impactful to your career? Is it attending work social events? Maybe working extra hours? Maybe adjusting your physical appearance to fit in? Or maybe sharing more about your personal life to connect with others? And if you're like me, you may be like, well, I want to answer all of them. But I'd love to know, if you had to choose, between them, which ones do you think are most impactful? Okay, so as we're getting those votes in, I'll keep going and look forward to those results as they come in. So, one of the questions we asked in our data was around, what type of behaviors lead to advancement in organizations. And there are many things around those behaviors that you might expect. So specifically, we found that everybody, no matter what their race or gender backgrounds, tended to feel that things like producing high quality work were really important, offering innovative solutions, and getting along well with their coworkers. So all of that to me makes a lot of sense. You want to produce high quality work, you want to make sure you're offering innovative solutions to your team, as well as getting along well with your coworkers. However, other responses, curiously enough, based on identity, we did see different weight for four particular behaviors. We found that Black and Hispanic employees felt that their physical appearance, attending social events, working extra hours, and sharing personal information were the most impactful to their career, and significantly more had an impact than compared to their white peers. And so this is really interesting because, while we all experience those informal rules of the workplace, it was interesting to see this data around, for advancement, Black and Hispanic employees experiencing a higher sense of those experiences. Okay, now getting to the question that you all just answered, maybe we can pull up those poll results. Who do you lean on the most to support you in navigating those unspoken rules? Colleagues, managers, mentors, or friends and family? Again, it may be one of those things where you say all of these folks, but would love to know kind of where we see the most support. Okay, excellent. Thank you so much for those poll results. So what I'm seeing is 57% of us said our colleagues, only 8% of us said our managers. And I'll get back to that. That certainly tracks with the data that we collected. 21% of us said our mentors, and 14% of us said our friends and family. So we found that that is very much in alignment with the data on who is there to support you within your organization. Most people do not say their manager, which is certainly a problem when we think about management training and management capabilities in organizations. That if our managers are there to help guide us in our experiences in our careers, but most of us don't feel comfortable going to our managers or don't feel like our managers are there as a place of support to understand those unspoken rules, that certainly can have an impact on our careers, right? And so that certainly is the missing link, I would say, in our workplace experiences, is having managers that we feel like we can talk to and we can learn from about these topics. We asked specifically around trust. And as you likely know, trust is so huge when it comes to your management relationship. It all really starts with trust. And people of historically marginalized identities do tend to have less trust in managers to make decisions about the future of their jobs. If you don't trust your manager, you likely aren't asking the questions that are needed for your development, and you certainly may not be speaking up when you need help or support. And so what you're seeing here is the question around, I trust my manager and company leadership to make fair decisions about the future of my job. And here you can see the difference in the gender responses as well as the difference in racial responses. And while they may seem small, these differences in percentage do indicate a significant difference in terms of the experience based on just two of these identity demographics. And we certainly could have asked about a host of, many other identity demographics. Last but not least, when it comes to understanding some of the data around unspoken rules, we asked folks, who has helped you understand the criteria and process for advancement in your organizations. And 52% in this data said our manager and supervisor, but a glaring 23%, so almost 1 in 4 said no one has helped them to navigate and understand these unspoken rules. And so if you reflect on earlier, 1 in 3 people said they know these rules exist and that they do have an impact on their career, but only 23% of folks are saying, well, no one is helping me to navigate this. And so part of my impetus for writing the book Unspoken was to empower people to know how to navigate these unspoken rules. One, to know that they exist and they're not something that are just in our brain. It's not just us, like these things are really happening, even if they're not formally written down somewhere. But certainly most importantly, how to navigate. What do we do with this information? Now that we know unspoken rules exist, what do we do with this information? So in my book, I break the book down into 3 different chapters, or 3 different sections, each with a few different chapters. And section 1 is all about who are you in the inside, who are you as an individual, but also who are you at work and who do you want to be? What is your individual identity and what is your workplace identity? And so I talk about owning your story. I talk about the power of your strengths, and I talk about authenticity and code switching and the power of that. In section 2 of the book, I talk about tools to navigate. And so once we have a clear sense of who we are and how we want to show up in the workplace, how do we actually navigate? What are the tools that we can use? And so I talk about having your own personal standard of excellence and why that's so important, how you read the room and understand the power and influence dynamics that are happening in your workplace. How do you build networks of influence, as well as what are the ABCs of negotiation? How do you use negotiation, which is one of my favorite things to talk about? But how do you use that as a tool to navigate your workplace environment, as a tool for empowerment? Then last but not least, in the third part of Unspoken, I go really deep into how do we create a career playbook? How do we create a career, not just our job that we're at today? How do we look beyond that and think about our entire career and how we want to show up? How do we lean into those tough moments that we may experience, whether it's a job loss or a difficult boss that we're working for? How do we create our own niche in an organization? And then certainly, how do we bring all of this together to write our own playbook? And so, as we think about what we can do, as we utilize these tools, I also encourage us to think about what ways we can help demystify unspoken rules for other folks. And so, it's one of those things that, if we want to dismantle the if you know cultures, we got to bring people into the know. We have to help people understand some of those unspoken rules. And when we are in positions of leadership and power, be much more transparent and equitable and how we codify and share and act upon these unspoken rules in our organizations. And so here are some strategies that I call spoken strategies that I think every single person can start to implement as they're navigating and helping others to navigate unspoken rules. So crafting and sharing your elevator pitches, understanding, what is your elevator pitch? Why are you at your current organization or in your career? What are you bringing? And so that's part of owning your story and your identity. Be transparent with salary, with peers and mentees when at all possible. As long as it's not violating any rules in your organization, it is important to be transparent to help folks to know, what type of salary range they should expect in certain jobs. You also want to hold knowledge sharing sessions, as much as possible, whether it's with someone who's brand new to the organization, or maybe you learned a new skill at a conference or something, making sure you're creating space to have knowledge sharing. And the great thing about knowledge sharing is I always believe it can go multiple ways, right? And so even if you're thinking of a mentor-mentee relationship, think about how you can both share knowledge with each other. So we're all kind of bringing each other into that if you know atmosphere. Encourage job shadowing. That goes along with both mentorship and sponsorship, as well as inviting others to the tables that you may have benefited from. You may call that allyship. You may call that good mentorship. You may call that, being a good person. Whatever you want to call it, it's vitally important to invite others to those tables, to those opportunities and experiences that you've benefited from. So with that, I'd love to turn it back over to Monica as we dive deeper into some of these topics that I've shared. I welcome you all to stay connected with me even beyond our Q&A session right now. Connect with me on LinkedIn, share with me your questions. I'd love to continue and keep this conversation going.
Thank you so much, Ella. There are so many questions already coming, and I invite anyone who wants to ask a question to put it in the Q&A panel now. I appreciated reading your book so much. I felt like I was learning so much, and so I have so many questions too. So I wondered if I could start off by just asking you about this idea that in terms of unspoken rules, you say, in the spirit of speaking, that there are cheat codes that we could learn across all kinds of organizations. But you also say, and I really appreciated this, that we're also responsible to learn the culture of the organization we're in as part of our personal standard of excellence. That's a responsibility we have. And so, how do you think about that tension between cheat codes and rules that apply across all kinds of organizations, and then customizing it or reading the room, like understanding the codes that are unique to the culture you're embedded in?
Absolutely. And I might even add a third element of that. When does it become a problem or a issue of equity and access when we have these unspoken rules, right? Because some of them are innocuous, like, we don't, business hours are 9 to 5, but we kind of don't have meetings after 3 on Fridays, right? That is something that likely won't hold someone back in their career. I'll answer the third question first and then go back to the first two. At the moment where we see disparate impact, when we see these unspoken rules actually having a negative impact or a differential impact on people in an organization's ability to get promoted or hired or get the feedback they need or even get the exposure to senior leaders, that's when it becomes a challenge. And so taking a step back, every organization and every industry will have a culture. Sometimes that's part of why we love working in that industry or working at that organization. And sometimes it's really hard to put culture on paper. You have to kind of experience culture. One definition of culture, it's the way we do things, right? And so I think as long as we have humans and organizations, we'll always have those formal written things and we'll have those informal things. And again, sometimes they can be great. I had a student talk to me about their internship recently, and they said when they first first joined, they were a little taken aback because everyone in the morning would be high-fiving each other all over, the organization as a way to say hello. And at first, it was very strange to my student because she had never experienced a workplace, environment like this, and that's not really something that would be in the handbook, right? But once she was there for a few weeks, she got comfortable with it. She was excited to give folks high fives in the morning, and she had then become part of the culture, right? So that's an example of something that while someone can tell you, you'll see people high fiving, don't be alarmed. That could be a good heads up. It's not until you experience something like that that you can really become a part of it, right? So that's one of those ones that certainly would be on the positive side because it helps people to feel like they belong in the culture, and most folks are able to participate in that activity, right? But let's take a different unspoken rule, like social events, which is one that often comes up in this work. And so, if you are not invited to the golf outing, or maybe you don't accept the invitation because you've never played golf, and you may be a little intimidated by even the prospect of being in an uncomfortable environment, and you don't realize how much business that we actually do at this organization or in this industry on the golf course, you may not even understand that you're missing out on that opportunity, right? And
Right.
so there's some dual responsibilities. There's a responsibility of you as an individual to understand, learn your organization's culture, ask the right questions, ask as many questions as you can, get to know your peers, get to know your manager, and really try to understand, get an understanding, read the room, as I say in the book, understanding the culture that you now join. However, it also, as most things in this work are both top down and bottom up, there's also responsibility of leaders to make sure there are not unspoken rules like meet us at the golf course, and you'll be more heavily considered for that promotion. We have to make sure that we don't have those unspoken rules, especially those that can to negatively impact someone's opportunity to advance or just even thrive in the workplace.
So important. And we people who are further along in our careers and also at different levels of status are going to be blinded to these things sometimes, right? So I imagine it's also really important to keep sensitizing ourselves and keep listening with an ear toward things that we've become inured to, or we accepted at some point that we shouldn't accept.
Absolutely. And I think that's why it's so valuable to make sure you're having those two-way conversations with new employees, with employees that may be coming in externally, or employees that have just had a different experience, right? Because some of these things you just get so used to. This is how we do things, right?
Yeah.
Especially when you've been at an organization for a long time. So understanding culture, understanding even shifts in culture when there's a new leader or there's change in the organization, all of that is really important. So that's a great point. Thanks, Monica.
So we have a mix in our audience typically of people who come from the work and practice side of being curious about the topics that we bring to the speaker series, and a lot of researchers join us as well. And so there's a question that I want to start off with in the question and answer panel about your data collection and your methods. And I know this is not an academic seminar, it's designed to talk about the application of your ideas. But do you want to talk a little bit more about how you collected the data and the interpretive process that you used so that people in who are listening can understand the methods? And then we'll go deeper into unpacking some of what you shared in your findings.
Absolutely. So the great thing is that this data is publicly available. If you look for the Gallup Center for Black Voices website, this was a national survey that we sent out in our Q1 of 2024, so just this time last year. And we had more than 3,000 respondents on that survey. And so what we were looking for is correlational data. So we weren't looking for any experimental data in this particular research exercise. And we did not get any qualitative data beyond some open-ended responses. And so this was not one of those that we went back and did interviews, but that would be what I would would love to see in the future for understanding a bit more about this data. But yes, that data is really available for anyone that like to learn a little bit more about the Gallup Center for Black Voices. And I encourage you to look at so much of the data that they publish year long on different topics. And while it certainly is the Gallup Center for Black Voices, they talk about all different identities and backgrounds in the work that they do.
So that's going to take us into a question posed by Katrina in the question and answer panel, but I think it links from your data into your kind of owning your strengths and owning your story part of your book. And Katrina says that when she was listening to you talk, part of what she was hearing is that at what you were talking about with all of these moments of encountering unspoken rules was also a need to humanize oneself in the face of stereotypes or in the face of potential misunderstandings or other kinds of bias.
Mhm.
And do you want to talk a little bit about leaning into the human side and humanizing and what you mean by that?
Yes. So, and if who did you say submitted the question so I could take a look at it as well?
It's Katrina.
Okay. Thank you so much, Katrina, for your question. Um, I'm just going to review it just here so I make sure I'm understanding what's being asked. Awesome.
Yeah,
Humanize your.
I can read it aloud for the audience if they're not looking at the panel. That's another good thing I should do. So all of the options for factors that impact perceived success in the workplace that you were talking about, like attending social events, physical appearance, working extra hours, and so on, seem tied to humanizing yourself, especially for white colleagues, and compensating for additional workload in the face of pressure to get results and stand out as an asset, right? Cue Black excellence or codes around Black excellence. And Katrina was curious for you to share more about the if you know codes in that space.
Yes. Okay. Thank you so much. And again, Katrina, thank you for that thoughtful question. So, I like how you describe that as more humanizing yourself. And I don't think I thought about it that way, but that's exactly what you're doing, especially with those elements of sharing more about yourself, attending social events outside of your working hours. And so, one, I do think that's a challenge in workplace environments that, these elements that are not part of our job are become part of our job, become part of our evaluation, become part of how people see us. And so for me, I am not here to say we should or should not have, these informal rules, but I do think they should not be unspoken. I do think it should be really clear to folks, yeah, hey, we have these social events, and this is where a lot of senior leaders tend to come to meet our newer employees. So we encourage everyone to attend, right? So they can meet our senior leaders. Something even just as simple as that for people to know that, not only is this a social event that is hosted by this organization, but it's really important for your development, right? And I would want to see even more explicit conversations from mentors and managers, right? Particularly managers, because that is their job as the manager of those team members. And so I think it's a challenge. So Katrina, I want to acknowledge that it is a challenge, especially when folks are feeling they have to go and be above and beyond, humanize themselves. But I also think there's often a gap of understanding. So the folks that are hosting these social events, or maybe the folks that have been there for so long, they're so used to them, they may not realize the additional psychological, physical, and even sometimes financial burden that comes along with these social event expectations like golf or even happy hours that can seem innocuous again, but maybe that requires some folks have to have childcare or other differences that we see in people's experience of these aspects. And so I think it goes back to not only humanizing, but closing some of those knowledge gaps. And many of us know that representation, that's one reason representation is really important. If you don't have, let's say, someone who's a caregiver on the team or someone who is a caregiver whose voice is represented in these decisions, then there may be a gap in people understanding that, 5 p.m. every single Thursday may not be feasible for everyone. So you're only getting a certain demographic or type of employee, or people are having to go above and beyond to show up and to be there, right? And so I think there's multiple ways that we uncover, unpack, and even dismantle some of these unspoken rules in workplaces. And it starts with us being honest that they exist. Many organizations, if you just say, are there informal rules that can impact advancement? Of course, probably for legal reasons, if nothing else, they'll say no, right? But every single person I talk to, no matter their background, no matter what industry they're in, they're like, oh, yeah, this is how things are done, and that can have an impact. So these things exist. And when there are process issues, so if there are issues in how we're evaluating team members for promotion, or process issues in hiring, those certainly can be equity issues, right, that we want to make sure are changed. But some of these other elements are issues of belonging, and the experience people have in the workplace. And the more that we understand our employee and team members' experiences, the more that we can work to change those things. So some of them will be positive, like the high fives, right? We want to keep that going. But when those other unspoken rules have a negative impact on a team member's experience, we also need to know those so that we can start to shift a culture.
So what I part of what I appreciate about some of the difficulty of what you're doing in this book, I think, is that you're helping people find spaces to feel empowered and to own their own story. And you're also deeply continually advocating for a different kind of workplace, right? And that I think we don't want, in the way the listeners are responding to you, to seem like we're privileging one side of that conversation or the other. I really hear they're both so important. And I think that comes through in a question by Zach Brady in the Q&A list, which is growing rapidly. Um, how could people who are from visibly marginalized groups, or people who have disabilities, for instance, and have difficulty attending in-person events, um, navigate the unspoken rules and appear in a way that doesn't compromise their health or their safety?
Yeah. So thank you for that question, Zach. And Monica, thank you for that context. What I will say in response to that context is that for me, without knowing the individual situation or, company culture, it's impossible to have like a one size fits all of do's and don'ts, right? Which is how we even arrive at this place, because you can't put
Right.
everything in the handbook when it
Right.
comes to human behavior, right? Again, some stuff is good and organic that happens, and we don't want to diminish that humanity either. But for me, this is all about helping people to understand that in most organizations, these unspoken rules exist. And unfortunately, in some organizations, they can have a negative impact on folks from historically marginalized identities. So knowledge is power. Like, knowing this is the first step. And then a second step is understanding your own organization and the dynamics there. To Zach's question, around ability and disability, and how it could feel unfair even that these opportunities are created for social events. I would, if you have the avenues to advocate for yourself, or to speak to HR, or even go through an employee resource group. I think there are multiple avenues depending on your organization, but that is certainly something that should be brought to light. I encourage organizations to have many different types of ways to connect, especially if they're focused on building community. So some may be happy hours in person, some may be virtual events, some may be during work hours, some may be after work hours, right? Some may be drinking and eating and socializing. Others may have nothing to do with that, to make everyone feel comfortable. Everyone does not drink, everyone does not feel comfortable. Some people have very specific dietary restrictions, which makes it uncomfortable to be in those specific environments, right? And so the more that, hopefully, in assuming positive intent, assuming that the leaders in your organization would care, maybe it's a simple oversight. It could be an area of discrimination, but Likely, what I've often seen is that, again, because representation matters, there's not representation in these conversations. No one is thinking about, oh, well, we should make sure that every other event has some virtual connectivity. And so that could be an opportunity for you to make a suggestion, or certainly if it feels exclusionary, an opportunity to bring it up to HR for them to handle through their channels.
Thank you for that. I think making these conversations more explicit, right, is such an important part of your message. And I was really appreciative and also curious about the part of the book where you write about negotiating what you want and need from a place of power. And you say that your core tenet is be right, be ready, and be excellent. But you're not saying do that at the expense of your own health and well being. So, how do you think about that core tenet and not being overloaded, exhausted, or going to Katrina's point of doing it to try to be meeting an impossible standard of excellence that's biased against you?
Absolutely. I think this is one of the core things you have to develop in your career, which is why I start the book with talking about your identity. So before we can even get to excellence, we have to know who we are. We have to know who we are and our experiences in life, how they've shaped us as a person, and then how they've shaped how we experience the workplace environment. Because we all have our work selves and our personal selves. And the more that those two are able to overlap in a healthy way, the more authenticity we experience. But we certainly, and I'm of the mindset that you can't really bring your whole self to work. That's not really realistic because we do have different parts of ourselves that may not be appropriate for work. How I am with my best friends is not the same way I am when I'm teaching a class, right, at Georgetown. Now, I hope that if someone sees me in both environments, they can still tell it's me. I still have my same personality. My voice is the same. But I am a complex and have multiple identities and multiple ways that I like to show up in the world, right? And I think that's okay as long as they are all authentic to who I am. The challenge becomes when I have to change who I am. So it's not just putting on my professional hat, but I have to downplay some of my identity to be in a said workplace. When we see issues of authenticity, then we see code switching being something that can have a negative psychological impact on someone. Um, and so hopefully, maybe I missed the last part of the question, but I wanted to kind of talk about identity. Oh, you talked,
Yeah.
you were asking about standards of excellence. So once we kind of understand who we are, how we want to show up, we also have to be honest with ourselves about how we show up best. And this will evolve over time. But if you have gone to college, for example, or even we can go back to high school, you had to learn how you best study, right? Some folks can study with a lot of music. Some folks, like me, I need complete silence. Some people want to stay up all night, and that is where they get their energy. At 11 o'clock at night, they are ready to lean in. I wake up at like 5 a.m. if I have something important to do because that's my best time to think, right? So we all have our best ways to work and show up, and we know what it means to be prepared. We know what it means for ourselves when we've done our very best in whatever that is, whether that's, a performance we're giving, whether that's a paper we're writing. There are external standards that we are often measured by, but we also have this internal standard of did I do my best? And if you don't have that, I encourage you to lean in and understand what does it require for you to show up as your best self in the workplace? Is it making sure you get your morning meditation or workout in? Is it making sure that you have a lunch break so that you can disengage for a few moments and come back as your best, right? Ultimately, my goal is for people to define how they show up as their best selves. And that should be based on feedback you do get from other people. So I'm not saying develop this in a bubble and don't ask other people for feedback. Absolutely. Ask your managers, ask your peers, get some 360 reviews, do the whole thing. But once you understand really how you're showing up as your best, that should be your standard of excellence. Therefore, when you have external standards that may be shifting standards based on bias and discrimination, you aren't as impacted. Not saying that it doesn't hurt your feelings, not saying it doesn't frustrate you, but for me, when I know I've given my very best, and I've shown up, including getting that feedback from other folks who know what success looks like in the organization, then that's a cue to me that this may not be the organization for me. There may be some bias going on. To me, that's a strong cue that there's another conversation that may need to be had. And so it's not negating that external feedback. You're putting that as part of your process. But ultimately, you being proud of yourself and having that self confidence has to be the foundation, because otherwise, you're at the whim of whoever decides what that standard of excellence can be. And there's so much research on those shifting standards of performance in workplaces.
So in the book, and also in this section of the book where you're talking about excellence and the internal standard of excellence and how that fuels you in a different way, you tell a story that I found fascinating about losing a client and about how by the time that the client actually said goodbye to you and wasn't going to renew the contract, you knew what was happening. And you weren't particularly upset at losing the client, although it wasn't your aim, of course.
Certainly.
And I think that story and having your own internalized standard of excellence about how to handle that story is something it would be helpful to unpack. And it might go toward one of the questions, which is like a first things first question in the panel of questions here is, how do you even know when you're up against an unspoken rule?
Yeah. So you have to read the room, which is a whole chapter. And what is meant in my work around reading the rule is understanding the workplace and cultural dynamics that you're up against, understanding the power and influence dynamics. And the only way you can do those things is to ask questions, to form relationships, and to be observant. And so anytime you're in a new space, I like to observe first before I jump in and talk. Not to say you can't give your perspective, because that's certainly why they want you in the room. But, oftentimes we are trying to demonstrate competence right out the gate, as opposed to understanding, who are the power players, understanding who are the decision makers, the formal and informal decision makers, right? So someone may have a particular job title on the website, but you notice they're in all the meetings with the senior executives, even when it doesn't necessarily align with their role. So that gives you a clue. This person may have some of those other influencing mechanisms. Maybe they're a person that's highly influential in this organization, despite their formal title, or what have you, right? It also is in how things get done, right? So you may experience that you may be a person that loves formal direct communication, but you work on a team where everyone emails everything and no one has like conversation, right? And so how does that impact how you get feedback? How does that impact how you're able to pivot? I know in some organizations, feedback is never given via email unless it's like for a formal performance review, right? All other feedback is not given that way. There's no way for you to know those things until you experience them, and or learn them by proxy of other people that have experienced them in the organization. And so you have to spend time. You have to put in that time to understand those dynamics. If I could give you a book on every single organization, I would. But these are some of the cues that I would suggest that you look for and see how they manifest in your organization. I think it's a great conversation to have with a more seasoned mentor in your organization, because they've lived it, they've experienced it, and they can often put to words maybe things that you're just observing for the first time.
There are a few questions from different people coming up in the chat about unspoken rules about keeping quiet.
Okay.
And especially when one is, what advice do you give for people when they come against unspoken rules that may go against a value? For instance, don't challenge a certain leader or don't criticize people higher in the hierarchy, but you see something that you feel is a values-driven issue. Um, how do you work with people around those kinds of unspoken rules?
Yeah. So one, I am excited anytime someone is able to discuss their values in a way as these questions are formulated. Because part of that is that self work you have to do on the front end in those first three chapters around who you are, what are your values, because sometimes people don't even know what their values are until they've felt a sense of violation, right? So if you've done that work, you're really clear. One, that's going to influence the type of organization you even want to work for to begin with, right? And you will probably more quickly know when it's time to pivot, when those values are in conflict in your work environment. And so I am not a proponent that you should stay anywhere longer than you have to, if there is misalignment with your values. Now, I want to acknowledge that everyone doesn't have the privilege to say, quit their job tomorrow. I don't have that privilege, quit my job tomorrow. But if I was in that situation where something was misaligned with my values, I would, one, try to understand what are the usual forms of communication and managing up even in that situation that people use. So I would ask a mentor, I disagree with what was said, or I disagree with this thing that's happening. Is there someone I can talk to? What would you advise? Right? I would get some information. And in that information gathering, I would try to understand what are the formal and informal communication channels. Maybe these types of issues are often discussed in our employee resource group meetings, and they take that information back to the senior leadership team in a more formal way, right? If that happens, that's something you may not know. Again, wouldn't be in your rule book, right? But maybe that's something that often is happening. Now,
Mhm.
if it's not happening, right, and you don't feel comfortable, again, I am a proponent of using the formal channels of HR when you can, the formal channels of your manager, if that's not the person you have the conflict with. But ultimately, it may be clear to you that the organization or the leadership of the organization isn't in alignment with your values. And that's where it may be appropriate for you to think about your exit strategy. Again, not exiting today, but what is your strategy,
Mhm.
and how do you implement that, and
Mhm.
how do you reflect enough to make sure that you're in your next organization, you're looking for those things so you don't come up against those same barriers. I've often coached folks that, they go to three or four different jobs and they run into the same issues because they haven't done that front end work of understanding what they're really looking for in their work experience, and what things may rub up against that and cause tension there.
We only have a few minutes left and so many great questions, but I'm summarizing across a few to say, are you discerning any patterns in unspoken rules around remote versus hybrid versus in-person work?
Yes. I did a study with the Slack organization a few years ago, as we were transitioning from fully virtual during the pandemic to many offices, going back in person, at least in some capacity. And it was really clear in the research survey that we did, that women and people of color, compared to their counterparts, did not want to go back into the office. They felt it was a much less discriminatory experience when they were able to work from home. They felt less experiences of microaggressions. They also felt the ability to disconnect and not have to feel in that environment all day. Even if they're working all day, they weren't necessarily in those spaces that made them feel that discomfort. So absolutely, I think there's differences in demographics. I also would point you to, research on organizations needing to be really explicit about their expectations for in-person, hybrid, or remote working, and how that can have an impact on career advancement. While I know in the headlines there's a lot of negative pushback on those companies that said, you can't get promoted if you don't come in 2 days a week, while I have challenges with that, from an inclusion perspective, I certainly appreciate the transparency of it to say, hey, in this organization, if you want to work here, this is how we do things, right? And we can argue fairness, and we certainly can argue ways to go about that in a more inclusive way. But it certainly gives me the knowledge that I need to make a career decision, at this point in time, understanding that's an expectation, as opposed to me wondering why I was hired as a virtual team member, but I am not able to get promoted even though I'm doing high quality work.
Right. Will you come back again? Because there's so much more to talk about.
I would love
Thank you,
to.
Dr. Washington, so much for the work you're doing, for the book. Unspoken for the conversation today. I just want to encourage people who are listening with a lot of questions that we didn't get to today, to go get the book and read it, because you are generous in how you share your personal story in the book, and there are questions about your personal story in our chat panel today. And also, there are questions about the discomfort of this work and of confronting unspoken rules. And you really help and coach people to lean into the uncomfortable moments as spaces of growth. And so there's so much more to talk about here. You have your finger on a space where all of us have need to grow. And I just appreciate how much you're helping all of us learn. Thank you for being here.
Thank you, Monica, and the Positive Links team for having me. Thank y'all for your questions and engagement. I look forward to keeping the conversation going and maybe coming back sometime soon, and certainly keeping the conversation going via LinkedIn.
I hope so. Thank you, everyone, for joining us today.
Thanks, everyone.